Hello, welcome to Best Recaps. Today we'll be watching a police and suspense story. After being accused of the death of another officer, a detective from Los Angeles dispenses his own justice in search of answers and revenge. So today we'll be watching Kings of the Street. The movie starts by showing us the everyday life of Tom, who heads to an empty and dark place to illegally sell weapons. Tom greets the two men with the word konnichiwa, and then tries to sell them a machine gun while constantly insulting them. This causes both of them to end up beating the man while repeating that they are Koreans, and that it's insulting for him to use Japanese words with them. Soon they both flee with the car and the weapons. So Tom contacts his partner to track down the criminals. Upon arrival, Tom stealthily enters to retrieve his weapon, which is next to the trackers, and then heads to the main door where he shoots a man at the reception and another in the bathroom. Finally, an elderly man tries to protect the place, although obviously he is unsuccessful. Tom puts on gloves to analyze the entire crime scene, where he discovers that a sealed door contained two girls in a cage. Outside, his boss is interviewed by a woman, and he says they are police officers to admire, while the mentioned individuals mockingly scold their colleague Tom for taking a man's life while he was defecating. Then their team complains that they probably won't get much coverage in the newspapers since Tom was a fairly well-known detective. Santos tells him he should have left at least one alive, but this makes the man angry as he believes he's better at handling such situations. At that moment, their boss enters to calm the situation and enthusiastically congratulates Tom for taking down the mobsters. However, his face doesn't seem so pleased. Outside, the officer Terrence Washington says he would pray for the victims' families, but Tom believes the only victims were those girls who were about to be sold on the black market. Washington mentions that despite that, the men deserved a trial as they would soon have problems with the South Korean government for what he just did. Tom excuses himself, saying it wasn't an act of racism, but simply justice. At that moment, they begin to fight, but their boss quickly separates them, while forbidding Tom from approaching the officer again. In the hospital, Tom admits he's waiting for a nurse, and a man tells him he did the same, because if the woman he was in love with changed her shift, he did too. Over time, he managed to win her over. Soon the man realizes that Tom is the policeman from television and asks if those mobsters had shot at him first, but they are interrupted by an officer who calls the supposed insurance salesman, Captain James, revealing that he was actually part of the police department. Before leaving, James asks Tom not to stray too far, as he couldn't recover from it. Minutes later, Grace helps tend to Tom's wounds, and amid flirting, the woman closes the curtains to have a romantic moment with the detective. The next day, Tom undergoes an intensive interrogation, but he ends up lying, mentioning that they had shot at him first and that he had entered their house because the screams of the girls alerted him. Later, Tom meets with his colleagues at a party, and his boss mentions that they have named him a commander, while his friend tells him they have decided to give him the keys to the city. Tom takes the opportunity to show them the card that James had given him, to contact him, and asks why Internal Affairs is now trying to catch him. To which his colleague responds that his old friend, Washington, started snitching. Tom is ready to beat him up, but his boss stops him and mentions that the man is doing it because he had fired him earlier. So he started trying to take away his best agents. However, he believes he can keep everything under control as he did in the past. Despite his boss's words, Tom chases Washington to the grocery store, but before entering, he realizes that two armed men have also arrived at the scene. So Tom rushes to warn Washington, who believes they have come to take his life. Suddenly, the criminals shoot down the shopkeeper and the officer before fleeing. Tom tries to help, but it's too late, and two police officers believe the detective is the culprit. Subsequently, the boss watches the recording of the incident, and Tom tries to excuse himself, mentioning that he was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. But the man scolds him, had previously forbidden him to approach Washington to avoid suspicion. He then demands that Tom hand over his weapon and tells him that someone will soon come to erase the recording along with any evidence, as he was not willing to lose his best detective. Later, Tommy and Grace rest alone as they discuss how police officers can easily change the narrative. Tom responds that it's the benefit of being one. She suggests honoring his friend because sometimes bad things can turn out well, although Tom mentions that in the real world, it's quite the opposite. The next day, his boss shows him the newspaper, where Tom is portrayed as a hero who tried to save an officer. However, he tells him that he will have to be transferred to a suitable place for him. It turns out they had moved him to the complaint department, where he constantly hears about the violence problems people suffer. At that moment, Captain James visits him to try to extract information, but without success. He decides to invite him to lunch to be alone. Once there, James mentions that his team found bullets of 3 different calibers in Washington's body, but despite this, Tom refuses to say a word. James turns off the recorder to have a serious conversation, suggesting that there is a third criminal who not only escaped from the scene, but also prevented them from obtaining the video of the incident. Before leaving, James warns him that he will end his entire group and that the third party involved will be his. Later, Wonder enters the captain's office, saying he can't initiate an investigation against him because his superior would mock him. But James tells him that he's not worthy of being a commander because he's seen him intimidate others to climb the ranks. Both start revealing their past crimes, although Wonder decides to leave soon. In the following days, Washington's funeral takes place, with a speech and cannons fired in his honor. Afterward, Tom tries to talk to the wife of his late partner, but the woman refuses to speak to him. Subsequently, Tom goes to the police department and asks Paul if he was planning to interrogate him, so the man reveals that he was one of his top suspects on the list. Tom tries to strike up a conversation to inquire about the different bullets found in Washington. However, the young man refuses to provide the information. Later, Tom visits the lab to request the ballistics report, but he is interrupted by Paul, who had also come to do the same. Outside, Tom asks if he has already cracked the case, and the young man tells him not to worry because he has no intention of exposing him at all. This infuriates the detective because he thinks they should have the culprits for the death of a police officer. But Paul mentions that he's the one who should be upset because he had to cover up the crime Tom committed. At that moment, Paul receives a call informing him that they have found a cigarette with DNA from the suspects. In the office, his colleagues reveal to him that some time ago, Washington prevented the conviction of criminals who were accused of child kidnapping, but it turns out they were the same ones who took his life, and Tom is completely puzzled by his late friend's decisions. Mike snatches the papers from his hands and tells him it's pointless to pursue them because they were the kind of animals that eventually eliminated each other. Later, Tom insists to Wonder that he should be allowed to take down the 2 criminals, but the commander is tired of him not being able to move on. So he suggests that Tom move forward, without the need for revenge. While Tom listens to a citizen's job complaint, Paul asks him to follow him to the bathroom, where he mentions that Washington deserved to die because he was very corrupt. However, Tom quickly realizes it's a trap, and after taking his phone, Paul decides to reveal everything he knows. Days before the attack at the store, Washington had stolen illegal substances, replacing them with brown sugar. At that moment, both seem intent on taking matters into their own hands. That same night, Paul and Tom venture into the criminal's old neighborhood, where they interrogate a little girl who moved there 3 months ago. Later, Tom tells him that they will scare a group of addicts, and the first one to run will be a criminal. As they approach, a man starts running, chased by both of them, but he ends up trapped in barbed wire. He claims not to know anything but tells them there is someone familiar with all the dangerous criminals. The mentioned person watches the 2 detectives arrive at his house and ends up handcuffed to the couch. At the same time, Tom finds illegal substances inside a bottle, and with no other choice, the man confesses that those 2 were kicked out of the neighborhood a long time ago. But there are very dangerous people in prison who know them well. Tom tells him he has 1 day to contact these criminals or else he'll be arrested on 2 charges. The next day, Tom intercepts Washington's wife at a bookstore, where he mentions that Terrence had $50,000 in cash with him. But upon seeing the man's intentions, Linda tells him that her husband had a good heart compared to him, and that money was because they had sold their house to start a new life in another city. In the office, Mike shows that they managed to remove the bullet from Tom's gun from the evidence and tells him not to worry because they would always cover for him. After that, the criminal calls him from prison to inform him about the mobster who goes by the name Scribble. Without wasting time, Tom invites Paul to pursue him. Soon, they manage to find Scribble on the streets and ask if he has seen the 2 criminals, but he tells them he hasn't seen them for a week and he only worked with them once a long time ago because they used to change their numbers constantly. Tom forces him to show them the place where they used to stay, and Scribble leads them to a house up in the mountains. There, the detectives observe various pieces of evidence of a murder. At that moment, Paul notices footprints on the floor, so he starts following them until he finds the buried bodies of the 2 criminals. But it turns out that this was only used to cover up the real culprits, so Tom asks Scribble for a meeting with him. That night, Grace listens to Wonder's story, in which he had decided to teach Tom a lesson in humility because he was too grumpy. Despite the laughter, the man remains thoughtful. Later, he watches the recordings of the incident in the store while receiving a call from Paul, who mentions that the criminals want to see them that night. Before embarking on their mission, Tom goes to Linda's house and hands over the evidence disc of her husband's death. Then he prepares for the meeting, telling Paul that he should go home and rest. But the young man insists on going together because he has also contributed to the investigation, so he's willing to eliminate him without leaving any evidence for the police. As they leave, James admits to having seen them roaming the streets these days and that it would be dangerous for them if others start suspecting. But Tom knows they need him to do the dirtiest jobs, so he's confident they wouldn't eliminate him so easily. When they arrive at the location, Scribble warns them that these men are very dangerous, which is confirmed when one of them points a gun at them from the entrance. Tom tells them they've come to negotiate and that they're not as ambitious as Washington was in the past. This convinces the men somewhat, and Tom takes the opportunity to show them a sample of the merchandise. However, Fremont tells him that the quantity of their products also matters because they have started distributing a substance from Afghanistan. At that moment, Tom asks them who they really were, but before Paul could say their names, they shoot him in the throat. A brawl ensues and Scribble ends up dying because he refuses to eliminate Tom. Later, the detective goes to Grace's house, and as she tends to his wounds, she shows him the news where Tom is wanted for the deaths of 2 undercover police officers, namely the supposed Fremont and Kautz. Grace scolds him for doing such low things, but their conversation doesn't last long, as her 2 colleagues enter to handcuff him. In the patrol car, they ask if he has figured out what really happened, and Tom tells them that after Washington released the men, they went to execute them at the Hillside House. So they have no choice but to say that they collected their DNA days before the incident with the intention of framing them. Tom tells them they are not smart enough to come up with such a plan, and seeing each other complicit, Tom realizes that the kingpin behind all of this is his commander. In reality, Washington had no intention of betraying him. Instead, he was after the head of the entire illegal network. Tom persuades them with questions, while he takes the opportunity to free himself from the handcuffs with the intention of strangling them. This causes the vehicle to crash. Later, both of them taunt Tom while playing with their guns. But as they approach, one of them is executed with a shovel, followed by Santos being eliminated with a pistol. On the other hand, Mike takes the recording of the incident from Linda, and before he can take advantage of her, Tom stops him, handcuffing him and putting him in the trunk while taking his phone and badge. The next day, Tom visits Wonder at his house, making him believe he still doesn't know who he really is. Tom asks him to contact Mike to discuss the deaths of the 2 police officers. So Wonder sends a message that actually urged them to hurry up and eliminate Tom. Tom shows him the message, and Wonder tells him that he has always been looking out for him, and they shouldn't worry because people like Santos and Mike were disposable, whereas Tom was someone special. A fight between the 2 ensues, where Wonder ends up handcuffed to the stairs, and before being executed, he tells Tom that the whole truth is behind the wall, so Tom begins to break it, realizing a pile of cash alongside documents that Wonder used to get his subordinates out of trouble. Despite this, Tom severs their friendship and ends Wonder's life. In the final scene, James meets with him, confessing that it was all part of his plan to take down Wonder, as the only one close to him was Tom, who was always willing not to give up until he knew the truth.